Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is John. This is Help Lawyer, and this is LegalOwl. This is where I get to chat to, as a founder, a Help Lawyer, I get to chat to not only lawyers, but the support services that are incredibly important for legal firms and for law firms. Nothing to do with marketing as these podcasts normally are, or these talks normally are, but mainly in support of the job that you as lawyers actually do. And so today, I'm glad to be kicking this off. Today, my guest is Dr. Alex LeBeau, who has recently come back from the ABA conference, Tort Conference in Arizona, I believe it or not. And so we're going to be diving into a bit about that conference, what's coming up, what's important in toxic tort, and how he, as an expert, is able to support law firms in the jobs that they do or in the cases that they have. Welcome, Dr. LeBeau. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I appreciate you having me today.
I'm really glad to have you because there's a lot of these talks that we have, or a lot of the kind of podcasts and interviews out there are mainly with lawyers, and I think it's really important that we look toward how we support the legal industry, and that's essentially what we do in Help Lawyer. We've got hundreds and hundreds of lawyers, law firms that are with us, and this is something that we like to do to be able to support them and to see how we can make their job a little bit easier. So tell me a little bit about what you do before we jump into ABA, but exposure consulting, what you actually do, your expertise, and how it fits into the legal industry.
Sure. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My company is called Exposure Assessment Consulting. Generally, I refer to myself as an exposure scientist. I have a PhD in toxicology and risk assessment, have my master in public health degree, and I am a certified industrial hygienist. Generally, what we do is we understand what exposures are in humans, in workplaces, or in the community, and to determine whether or not those exposures to chemicals, biological agents, or physical substances or physical stressors impact an individual's health, how they impact it, what their exposures are, what they may be getting inside their body from a toxicological standpoint, and determining the degree of harm or the degree of risk from exposure to those particular substances. So we offer scientific consulting. We use our scientific knowledge, a scientific methodology to understand what exposures are. Sometimes we even go out into the field and take samples and quantify what exposures are, and then do our risk calculations from that point. But we help people that may not understand what this type of science is, or how this science relates to what they're ultimately trying to show, whether or not the substance that somebody says that they're exposed to can actually cause the harm that they are saying. So that's what we do. We kind of look at this from a general aspect and say, okay, there's a literature, there's a data show that harm can be caused by exposure to this one particular substance.
Thank you. This kind of reminds me of probably people out there that it'll spark a memory in them if you've ever watched Erin Brockovich back in the day when that film. It kind of, the way you're talking is like, is that the kind of idea where you're helping to either prove something was toxic or defending a company against a toxic? So how does it work for you?
Sure. I mean, that's what a lot of people point to. Whenever I kind of describe what I do, they say, oh, the movie Erin Brockovich.
Yeah.
I mean, that is an example of things that can be done with this scientific consulting. Yes, it's gathering information from exposures, a community exposure. It may be something that is in the ground that's resulting in exposure, I'll say in a secondary manner. It may not be, somebody opening a lid to a container. It could be something that's entrained in the soil, the groundwater that's getting into someone's house. So a lot of people come to us because we have that expertise. We have the understanding of what is being done as far as what's regulated at the EPA, what EPA's decisions are, how they're kind of viewing things, and how their risk assessment process goes. And they come to us and say, listen, you're the experts in as far as a scientific standpoint for subject matter expertise here. Please help us out, give us guidance so we can go in there and say, yes, there is elevated risk and this potential that is resulting in harm, or the risk profile does not fit that of a being have from a causative standpoint for a risk level from exposure to whatever the subject is.
Now, Alex, you were recently at the ABA conference, and am I right in saying it was in Arizona? So you were in beautiful Arizona. I remember seeing a go.
I was gonna say it was beautiful there. It was the ABA Toxic Tort and Environmental Law Conference, and it was in Scottsdale, Arizona, and it was beautiful.
And you were actually given you were given a couple of presentations there regarding toxic tort and you know what were the changes or what's happening in the legal industry. Tell us a little bit about the conference.
Sure. So generally, it's an annual conference. This one was the 32nd annual conference, and it's a gathering of a number of different, I'll say, professions. It's attorneys and environmental scientists or hydrogeologists or people that deal from a scientific standpoint, and it's kind of a bringing together of both professions for presentation to people in the audience that may be dealing with these issues or may have issues that are coming up that they want to get knowledge on how the problems are approached from both a scientific standpoint and from the legal standpoint.
So let's jump into that, because obviously being kind of legal industry first as we are in Help Lawyer, while you were at the conference, there's obviously a lot of subject matter that you have to cover, but what would you say in the legal industry is the biggest problem, if you like, or the biggest couple of problems that are up and coming the lawyers should be looking toward? Certainly in 2024 and moving, you know, things are changing in the environment. There's a lot of probably toxic substances out there. Tell us a little bit more.
I'd say that the biggest subject that was covered during the talk was PFAS chemicals. I'd say 80% of the presentations were surrounding PFAS and exposure from an environmental standpoint, from a secondary exposure standpoint when it's in the environment, and from I'll say, direct exposure standpoint when it's in consumer products. There was a lot of focus and a lot of thought on where PFAS is going in the future.
Where is it going in the future? Let's talk about that, because you're mentioning products, and there's obviously a lot of products or even services, I guess, that are out there. Where is the biggest threat?
I think the biggest threat is what's currently unknown. The biggest threat revolves around how PFAS are going to be handled as we move forward, as far as discovery, as far as remediation, as far as exposures to products. You know, we know facilities that have processed and used PFAS, but the problem is, what about those facilities where we may not know that they use PFAS? There are some that are, you know, they use it, we have no idea. And now we're discovering it, going back and looking at records and saying, oh, well, we thought it was such a minimum amount, we didn't include it on our product specifications, but actually it was in there, and now you've probably got a problem.
Can you give an example of maybe the type of products that we are potentially looking at that could cause lawsuits or potential legal problems moving down the line?
Sure. I mean, there's so many, and I say this from Traditionally, PFAS have been used, polyfluoroalkyl substances have been used in products that that you didn't want things. They're high heat tolerant substances. They're also things that you didn't want other substances sticking to, like Teflon and pans. They're
Right.
used as good surfactants. That means reducing the surface tension on the surface. So there's lots of products because the PFAS is, I think, a good intermediary in a manufacturing process. It's included in there so to make sure things are not sticking to walls or not sticking to mixing type devices. If it's in the closed manufacturing system, to say that, okay, we're making sure we're getting 100% mixing or as close to 100% mixing. But there's a lot of things. I've heard that carpeting material has PFAS in it. We're finding that a lot of other. I just saw an article the other day that said energy drinks have PFAS in them.
No
And
way.
yeah, so but here's the problem.
Okay.
Recently, and this is another facet of what's going on. Recently, EPA finalized their maximum contaminant level (MCL) for PFAS in drinking water. Understanding what's in your product is important too. Was the drinking water that was used, or the potable water that was used for the manufacture of these energy drinks, did it contain low levels of PFAS and they just didn't know about it? I'm sure it was likely not entered into in the
Mm.
manufacturing process. We don't know, but if you're not testing and understanding what's in your product, then you don't know what's going out in your product, and that's a danger. And it's something that people definitely should get ahead on.
So let's, before we jump into where this kind of heads in terms of the legal industry, people are out there. There's obviously people listening to this are not just going to be lawyers. They're also going to be people in the industry, and even that are servicing in that industry, or even people who are listening. It might be exposed to PFAS. So let's talk just very quickly a little bit about the dangers of PFAS to the human body or to the environment in general.
So PFAS are generally referred to as many times. I'll say this are referred to in the media as the forever chemicals.
Yeah,
The
which is big in the
bonds,
news at the moment.
right? The bonds that make up the PFAS. There's a fluorine and chlorine bond. There's a very strong bond, very hard to break down. Again, it's heat tolerant. That's why they use it in heat settings. So it takes a lot of heat to potentially break that bond down. So they persist in the environment, and there is information to show that it could potentially persist in humans as well. Now, there's lots of, I'll say, the knowledge on what the actual human health problems are for PFAS are still being evaluated, and the weight of evidence is still being understood. But generally, I say a lot of the PFAS that are being regulated now, there's potential, there's concern for the potential of it causing cancer. Some
Wow,
studies have
and the,
shown. Go ahead.
that kind of, I don't know if I'm right in this. I mean, I don't want to make any assumptions, but would that be similar to, for many, many years, you've had the, I think the paraquat weed killer exposure that has caused cancer, that has been in lawsuits? Are we talking that kind of potential?
Well, depends. I'll say everything's, when we talk about the potential, everything comes down to exposure. There's a lot of
Right.
information.
Hmm.
When you look at potential carcinogenic outcomes or cancer outcomes, you're looking at what do studies in animals show, what we refer to as mechanistic studies or genotoxicity studies show, and
Hmm.
what do human studies show, studies that are called epidemiology studies. Those are looked at as far as this whole weight of evidence evaluation. Some evidence shows that there are potentials for carcinogenic outcome, like other substances we've identified.
Right.
However, other higher studies, like human studies, um, there have been inconclusive. I'll say some found small associations, some have not found associations. So that's why I say the science is still evolving on what the actual human health outcomes or potentials are from
Hmm.
exposures. And there's lots of different ways to even be exposed to Pfas. Generally, what the typical exposure routes are for humans are ingestion, when you think of eating something, inhalation,
Yeah.
thinking of breathing it in, or dermal contact, having contact on your skin. But, you know, those are all potential ways that it gets into you. And depending on the substance, your body may handle it different ways. And you have to think about it. If you have drinking water and there's a concern for exposure, you not only ingest drinking water, you not only drink it, but you shower with it too. Are you breathing in anything that's coming from the shower, or it's all over your skin? Is there a compound risk that you have to think about from all three different exposure routes? Those are things that we as exposure scientists look at and attempt to evaluate based, again, on the weight of evidence evaluation.
Where, Alex, where does this fit into the legal industry in terms of defense or prosecution? And, you know, what should law firms or toxic tort lawyers be looking toward as we kind of move through this time?
Sure. And again, I'm not an attorney. I'm not speaking as one, but I'm speaking as a
No.
scientist who sees this
Yes.
information. Um, you know, in one of the talks I gave at the ABA conference, you know, I talked to a few people there, and ultimately, and I'll put this out there, you know, do your own internal kind of risk assessment, whether it's at the facility, whether you are giving them counsel on what to do, and have them understand what their risks are. I heard a variety of stories while I was at the conference that some facilities or some manufacturers said, you know, I haven't had time to get up to speed on PFAS. I don't really know, well, what it is or how it's impacting us. And ultimately, and this is a thought from both sides. I
Yeah.
said, you know, you should do your own risk assessment, understand what's in your chemicals. Go back to your manufacturers and press them and say, did you use this, or have an understanding of what the process is, and say, I think you used it. Can you go back in your records and do your own risk assessment? Because, you know, ultimately I said, either you know what is in your product and you've done your own risk assessments, or you're going to be waiting for someone else to come tell you what's in your product, and them saying, you didn't tell me this was in here, and you've hurt me, and you've detrimentally hurt my health. This is a problem. You know before that happens, or you're going to find out later on when someone else tells you in your product. That's what the two dichotomies that you're looking at right there.
So you're suggesting that lawyers or, you know, legal firms that are representing perhaps manufacturers or various different products, that they are more proactive now than you know, than moving into a reactive phase. They should be moving forward, contacting their clients and carrying out these risk assessments.
I'd say yes. I think being proactive now, because here's what I'm seeing. The more and more time goes on, the more and more we're seeing additional consumer products actually contain PFAS. And at some point, it's going to be, it may be a number of different consumer products that we worry about or deal with every day. You know,
Yeah.
make sure you have, I want to say, an insurance policy, but make sure you've done your own risk assessment so you can understand. I mean, I'll give you an example of, you know, there was a manufacturer, I'm not going to name them, that said, oh, you
No.
know, our product does not have PFAS in it. And it was from an occupational exposure setting. And they said, okay, great, we're using it. It was a degreaser. And lo and behold, the manufacturer came out and said, oh, actually, it does have a small amount of PFAS in it. But people weren't protecting their employees to such a degree that they were, you know, minimizing exposure to it because they didn't think it had PFAS in it.
Yeah.
The more and more we go on, and again, the better and better technology is that we can see small amounts of this, because we're talking, you hear a lot of people talk about parts per million, parts per
Yeah.
billion. For PFAS, we're talking parts per trillion. And the better technology goes, the more you're going to be able to see this substance. So more and more consumer products and more products we're identifying that's actually in there. So doing the assessment now will save, from a proactive side, will save time later on, because at some point somewhere there's a high chance that someone will knock on the door and say, your product has PFAS in it. So are you going to just say, oh, yeah, we've done our assessment. Here's our risk assessment. There's no risk. We didn't identify it. Or are you going to say, well, we don't think there's a problem, but we haven't done our own assessment. Being proactive, I think, is going to be a better position for people in the long run.
So where do you sit, Alex? This is like a big, I've had this conversation with many criminal lawyers in the past. Is like, if you think the person, the perpetrator, is guilty, how do you feel about it? What's your, are you still going to defend them? That kind of thing. It becomes a very moralistic type approach. So I want to ask you, kind of, where do you see yourself sitting? Do you see yourself working with the law firms in order to protect the companies that are manufacturing? Or are you equally able to work on the other side where you are actually going to be defending, maybe not defending, but even on a prosecution side of things on a lawsuit to prove that this chemical did cause the issue? So it's probably a loaded question. It's maybe throwing you under the bus a bit, but where do you stand?
What I do from my standpoint is I'm a scientist. I follow the science. I look at the science, I look at the information, and I go where the science goes. So, I mean, it depends on what the particular scenario is, but I follow the science for that scenario. If the science is supporting that it doesn't cause health effects under the particular PFAS that we're concerned about, or the particular exposure route that we're concerned about, then that's where the science goes. If it's some other chemical that says, well, it is harmful, that was used in such a way that caused harm, well, that's where the science goes. So I don't, I'll say from a scientific standpoint, I follow the weight of evidence for the information that's presented from that standpoint.
It's a very diplomatic answer there, Alex.
Thank
you. So, wait, do you see? I mean, let's talk a little bit about the conference. How did you enjoy the conference? Was it well attended? What was the feeling about the subject matter while you were there?
I think it was a good conference. I think it had been better attended in years past, from what I understand, from what I have talked to people. There was a good number of attendees there, probably about 50 people there, but in years past, I've heard it's been much more. But again, I know COVID kind of impacted how we're looking at conferences. Again, there was a lot of PFAS, and it was a 2-day conference. I'll say a day and a half. And I think by the morning of the second day, some of the murmuring that I heard was, there's a lot of PFAS. I'm kind of tired of PFAS. It was a lot of information, and I think there was a lot of overlap of the information that was presented. So I think having, in my talk there, and I'll be honest, my talk was just a general discussion of toxic tort and litigation involving chemicals. Our talk was the last talk, but we talked about a bunch of other different chemicals than PFAS, and I think that was somewhat refreshing for the audience to hear, because it wasn't the same thing over and over again. They're very slight nuanced discussions on PFAS. I think PFAS was a good topic. I just think that it was a lot of overload, and there was some people who were a little overhearing about it by the second day breakfast.
Do you think the legal industry is making, I don't want to say mistakes, but do you think that they're getting too lackadaisical, maybe when it comes to not just PFAS, but toxic exposure?
No, I think overall, there are a lot of people that are. Well, I'll say this, and I've seen this before. I think there's a lot of proactive approaches here, but as far as say getting ahead of this, I've seen it more. It may be smaller manufacturers that either don't have the bandwidth or don't want to take the advice of those saying you need to get ahead of this. And I think that's where some of the danger is these smaller companies saying, oh, I'm not going to be hurt bad by it, or I don't need to get ahead of it, or whatever. And they may be an intermediary manufacturer for a product that is involved in larger companies. And they may have someone giving them counsel saying, you need to get ahead of this. And they just kind of blow it off because they don't think it's a big deal. They're just a small player in it. But ultimately, you can, I mean, your listeners probably know, and I've seen it. Those small players still get named when there are issues. So even if it's a small player that is getting counsel, they're not even taking that advice. It's kind of like when I give advice from a consulting standpoint. I say, this is what you need to do. And then people say, well, do I really need to do that? And then later on, they find out, yes, you really do need to do that. So again, it's the proactive approach, getting ahead of it, or is it playing catch up? I always call it playing catch up. If you're being reactive, you're continually playing catch up. Are you going to get ahead, or are you just going to try to be the least amount behind when something does happen?
And it's not a big deal until it is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Until you've
That's
got legal
correct.
counsel, sending you a summons or something like that, then it becomes a bit more of an issue. Where do you think, and let's jump away from PFAS, because obviously there's a lot of toxic exposure that is out there. What do you think is going to be the biggest problem, other than PFAS, that may be coming up for the legal industry, that they should be, okay, this could explode, let's jump into this? I mean, I know there's talk about, batteries and, this kind, there could be lawsuits regarding this. So where do you think this is going to go for the law profession?
So as far as community exposures that, again, are playing catch up, or potential exposures, one thing that has been, and I wrote an article about this for the ABA newsletter, was for ethylene oxide, exposures to ethylene oxide in the environment. EPA recently has finalized some rules. Ethylene oxide is a substance that is used for disinfection of medical
Okay.
devices. It's used for large facilities like that, or it's used in hospitals, dental clinics.
Okay.
So it's also an intermediary product. You think about the ethylene oxide; it's used to manufacture antifreeze in your car. But what they're concerned about are community exposures to this. So there have been some lawsuits surrounding ethylene oxide exposure, but this is going to be a bigger thing, especially because EPA is cracking down even more on these types of facilities to control what
Right.
their exposures are. It's the historical exposures that are going to be a concern. Going forward, it's going to be less and less because of the EPA regulations. But what were the historical exposures? Because no one knew about these exposures were even happening until like the mid 2010s, when people started
Wow.
monitoring for it. So that is a potential concern that is going to, I think, get bigger and bigger as more and more people, because there's a concern for ethylene oxide and cancer. So as more and more people potentially develop cancers, because it takes a little while for that to happen, are they going to go back and retrospectively look at what their exposures to ethylene oxide were, where they live, what the data shows, etc.? Another area that I think is going to be getting bigger, and it was for a while. It's things kind of ebb and flow in this industry.
Yeah.
Lead exposure, I think, has been coming back. There has been some talk I have heard of buried lines from telecommunication lines,
Right.
and they contained lead. This was in the early 1900s, and those lines were never taken out. They were just left in the ground. So, what was there any lead leaching from those lines? Did it get into
Yeah.
any groundwater? That's lead is going to continue. I mean, lead's everywhere. But it's the
Yes.
way that it is used and how the exposures are close to human populations that's going to be a concern. So there's lots of things I want to say that ebb and flow here, but definitely there are potential exposures that are I don't are somewhat man-made. Were we doing things years ago that has led to exposures now? And those substances don't go away. When I've worked on site remediation projects that were called legacy sites. These sites are from 100 years ago that had contamination, and we're still dealing with those problems. So the risk is still there. It's how we're managing in and what the exposures are going forward. That's going to be a concern that we have to address.
What would you say to law firms now? I mean, I guess that this is even beyond just the health care industry. There's a lot of law firms that support or defend the healthcare industry, but obviously this going into lead and everything else is going into construction, everything else. What would you say to law firms or legal counsel now, as they move forward? What should they be doing right now to actually maybe, as you say, be proactive and not reactive, look at when the horse is bolted, but what can they be doing right now?
From my standpoint, I would advise them to get up to date on the science. Have someone like myself come in and give a presentation on where the current science is, have someone knowledgeable on science and keeping track of where things are, and giving them the information, the raw information. Put it in buckets. This is what the information
Yeah.
says that is harmful. This is the information says that is not harmful. We can talk about it. Let's have a conversation, because ultimately, again, understanding the risk is going to be important for them on how they advise people, or how they address these potential matters as they come up. Because again, our subject matter expertise in this area, I think, is crucial, because again, I always go back to that. We're the scientists that are evaluating the exposure. Maybe it's even a team that they work with, understanding what
Yeah.
the ground contamination is, or what the typical remediation process is to reduce risk going forward. Maybe it's something, oh, you should recommend this to your clients because it's going to reduce the risk over a number of years, and I'll say reduce their surface attack area for any potential issues that come forward in 5, 10, or 15 years.
You mentioned there, Alex, that you go out. I mean, you can do talks and things for law firms and things like that. So should they contact you if they wanted to bring you in, and you would actually do a training workshop or something for the legal industry, for law firms in this subject matter, to get them up to speed?
Yeah, if they're interested, please. They don't call them brown bag lunches anymore, but I'd be happy to come in and give a talk during a lunch, or kind of help you get up to speed. Again, that's kind of what I did at the ABA conference. Was, hey, this is kind of where things are right now. This is where the science is somewhat going on these particular topics. So I am happy to come give those talks either virtually or in person, and just kind of give some preliminary guidance on where your concerns may be focused, and find out how that concern can help address issues in the future and help your clients.
Thank you for that, Alex. I want to just jump back into the conference side now. If they were a bit tired of the PFAS side of things and moving on to the different exposures as we talked about, do you think there is a danger in them ignoring one over the other? Because it seems like to me, if they're tired of the PFAS could explode, right? Because we're seeing that it's I've even seen it myself. It's more and more in the news. Yes, they're talking about it, but we're exposed to a lot of things, from the water and the air. I mean, we had COVID as well. And is there a danger that the legal industry could make a wrong judgment themselves by not moving forward and being proactive for the clients?
I think that they, from what I've heard and saw, are wanting to be proactive. I think that is from I'll say, presentation and conference standpoint. This is my own personal thought of,
Yeah.
I don't think that the conference did a fair job of ensuring that there was not enough, or there was lack of overlap on different presentations. I think
Yeah.
that's where a lot of them got fatigued. I don't think that they are ignoring this. I think that they are probably acutely aware of the problems. it's finding out the best way, and this is what I see as a potential problem, is finding out the best way for them to advise, or I don't want to say convince their clients, but
Yeah.
persuade their clients that they do need to be addressing this. I think a lot of the people, the attorneys that I've spoken with and seen, are aware of the problems. It's probably the frustration of getting their clients from one way or another to acknowledge that they potentially have a problem, or acknowledge that they need to get ahead of this. And again, as you said, there's lots of other issues as well.
Yeah.
I think there's as I've heard somebody say, at least even in my industry, there's plenty of work to go around. There are plenty
Yeah.
of issues to address. But and maybe that's a thought for the next conference, the ABA conference, is
Yeah.
present other topics so there's a better, well-rounded um, information presentation to the membership, so they can say, okay, this is coming down. Because I felt like our talk was the last one. I felt like we were rushing to get them other potential problems that were coming down
Yeah.
at the end of the conference, instead of kind of sprinkling that throughout.
So you said something that I want to jump into there, because I think it's important. And maybe if you're a law firm out there and you're thinking of this, or you're involved in toxic tort, not that I'm an expert in anything, but something that Alex has said has made me think that Alex, or an exposure consultant like him in the field that he's in, could almost be a secret weapon for you. And let me just ask you, Alex, are you also able to be the advisor to their clientele? Because you said something that says it's the lawyers getting the clients to listen, and sometimes the problem is there's disconnect between the two, and they don't see it as a big problem. So could a law firm then say, Alex, would you represent us in speaking with our clients to advise them? And there may be a legal issue there, I don't know, but I personally see that as maybe you being a kind of secret weapon to them, where they say, here is the expert, here is what you need to be careful of, listen to him, and then let's get around the table and make a decision.
I'd say yes. We can go in there and to their clients and talk from the human health side, saying, listen, this is what the dangers are. These are the risks that could be presenting to your consumers, your employees, the community members surrounding the facilities, what have you. I'll let the attorneys talk about the legal aspects, but I'm here to talk about the human health aspects and what they actually mean to the harm you may be causing someone if you are not careful. And a lot of people, and I've seen this, a lot of
Mm,
people, they have internal folks at these facilities, but these internal folks have a very specific focus. And I've seen a lot of them, their scope expanded so much, they have too much to take on. And that's where someone like myself is a benefit, to come in and saying, listen, those people can focus on their job. I'm here just to talk about this one specific subject and assist you in this one specific way. I don't want to get into the environmental health and safety individuals' way. They have their own thing. They're doing permitting, they're doing employee
yeah.
stuff. I'm here to help with this one thing. And that's where I think it would be a benefit.
Alex, I thank you so much for being my guest on the Legal Owl, and I'm sure that any lawyers listening to this are going to get a lot of benefit out of this, and how they can be more proactive rather than reactive. What would you say to law firms now? How can they get in touch with you, and how can you help them? Let's talk about that before we finish off.
Sure, and I appreciate that. I mean, you can go to my website, exposureconsulting.com, reach out to me. I'm happy to have a conversation with you, find out what your problems are, what you think your problems may be. I've had people contact me and say, well, these two chemicals are being used in this manufacturing process. I think this we may be making something that I'll use the word lightly, as a contaminant, or something that is a byproduct that may be in there, and I'm concerned about it. I'll happily address the concern. I can look at the risk. I can look at what's being produced, and going to the client saying, we need to get ahead of this. So you can reach out to me on the website. You can email me, alex@exposureconsulting.com. Happy to have a conversation, figure out how we can work together to help your clients to, again, minimize risk and improve human health.
Alex, thank you. Thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you are a toxic tort lawyer or you are a law firm who deals with exposure in any way, then please get in touch with Alex at Exposure Consultant. And also, if you're a member firm of HelpLawyer, then you can find Alex on there because he is one of our support experts. He's one of our support services on there. And if you need any consultancy, then you can get him, you can connect with him on HelpLawyer and drop a message from his profile direct to him as well. So if you have any questions, that you want to pose to Alex about any element of exposure consultant or any exposure, then you can certainly email us and we will get it straight to him. Or you can connect with him, as I said, on the profile. Alex, thank you for being a guest on the Legal Owl today. I really was delighted to have you, and I look forward to seeing what else you can bring to law firms all over the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.